Welcome Wargamers to a lore week that I have been excited to do for years. This series of videos will be all about the Great Mawtribes, one of the latest battle tomes to drop from Games Workshop for Age of Sigmar, combining Beast Claw Raiders and several of these small splintered sub-factions of Ogre into basically a cohesive army. In short, the Ogres are back together and I'm so excited for this series. And now to kick it off, right, to set the tone for our conversation about this faction, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about this the entire time that we're discussing this army. Because it's a question that's going to define every conversation that surrounds the faction. And a question that's full implications are hard to grasp and terrifying to see. So here is the question. What does it look like for a society to be utterly devoted to a single thing, and not just like one, random thing, right? Whether it's like commerce or pursuit of science or something like that, or even something as broad as survival, because that can mean a lot of different things, right? You figure, for example, like Keratin Overlords survived, but they did it a very different way using science and technology and engineering and that kind of stuff. But I mean, what if you were devoted to a single thing that was super primal? The entire scope of your worldview and your language, government, and religion was all centered around one instinctive primal need. As we explore Mawtribes this week, we're going to see what that looks like. Their specific need, right, the sole focus of the entire race is the need to eat. And it's not just like gluttony or like overindulgence. It is a part of that that certainly carries its themes here and there. But it's this more than that. It's this primal need to devour, an inability to be satisfied. The ogres of the mortal realms can eat just about anything, even dirt and sand, which is an incredible ability if you think about it, right? Because any other army, like a Cities of Sigmar army, they have to have huge supply lines and carry their food with them. No, ogres can just eat wherever they go, so that's a huge military advantage. But we aren't talking about hunger as we know it. Right, this is something far darker than that. It goes much deeper into their character. And so, as we said with our question, it is the single focus that everything this week is built upon. So we want to keep that in mind. And so now I want to transition into talking about the Mawtribes as a whole. And like all other destruction factions, you can really understand them and their beliefs based on their perception, worship, and understanding of Gorka Morka, who seems to be the catch-all deity of just destruction factions realms-wide. Now, I was kind of curious about this since they so heavily wrote Gorka Morka, or Gorka and Mork when they're separated, as the god of the Ironjaws, Bone Splitters, and Gloomspite Gits, or Greenskins, right? And he was kind of mentioned here and there in the Beast Claw Raider book, but I feel like we didn't have nearly as good a definition of Gorka Morka at that point, because it was so early in Age of Sigmar's, timeline. When the book was literally released, the writing was very different as far as lore goes a couple years ago. And the Beast Claw Raider book really wasn't my favorite when it came to lore, because there was a lot of theories, but nothing really specific outside of the role of specific units. But we get a bit more information in this book, in the Mawtribes Battle Tome. We know that Gorka Morka is indeed the green skin god. That is how they describe him. He's a green skin god. But to the ogres, they call him the gulping god, because Gorka Morka is the devourer of the realms. And this makes a lot of sense. For example, we talked about in Gloomspite Gits, the various sub-factions there see the power of Gorka Morka looking different, right? He's the moon and the spider of the Spider Fang. He's represented by the bad moon for pretty much all the other ones, but you know what I mean? They can all look at different aspects and see their deity in him. And in this, it is hunger, the devouring of everything around him. Gorka Morka is the eater of mountains, the drinker of oceans, a great maw that can never be filled or satisfied. And it doesn't go around devouring things like locusts, right, where it's a bunch of tiny mouths all biting a little bit. No, this is feast by conquest, war, and triumph. Massive ogres eating away at entire cities and nation-states. A few large hulking brutes set on devouring everything around them. And what I've found in this book is that they really harp on Gorkamorka as the Great Maw. In their ceremonies, they channel the power of this Maw, right? It leads them to food, it leads them to war. So don't get confused, like, if I intermingle those words or kind of slip them up. Gorkamorka is the Maw. The Maw that eats the realms belongs to Gorkamorka. It's his mouth. So that's the top of the pyramid, right? That's the top of the food chain for a faction that's all about food. The thing this faction reveres and wants to emulate, but what is the basic ogre like? Well, they stand roughly at twice the height of a normal person. Very large, broad stature with a huge gut, and it's easy to mistake them for just really, really big fat guys, but there is quite a bit of muscle beneath that blubber layer, which in fact acts as an incredibly thick natural armor, protecting a monumentally strong beast within it. Ogres are absurdly tough and possess a raw physical strength. They're able to rip enemies to shreds with their bare hands on the spot and begin devouring their prey with these sharp, shark-like teeth before they're even dead. This strength also obviously comes in useful in warfare because ogres are not the brightest in the realm, so complex weapons tend to not be their thing. There's a few outliers, we'll talk about those later, but the sheer strength they possess, even a basic club or a piece of scrap metal, becomes an unstoppable weapon in their hands. It's just enough force behind it. There are cannons and such, like I said, where it gets a little bit more complex later on. We'll talk about that when we talk about units. And when we talk about the Mawtribes in general, understand there's two distinct types of ogre and I guess sub-factions within there, right? There's the Gutbusters, who are the ones on foot, the typical ogre, and then there's this little subset called the Beastclaw Raiders. In this video, I'm going to focus more on the Gutbusters, and we'll cover the Beastclaw Raiders in another video. But on a high level, here's a very simple way to explain it. Gutbusters are the vast majority of ogres. At some point, some of those ogres were cursed with a magical storm that chases them, and they have kind of splintered off to become the Beastclaw Raiders. So BCR is kind of a subgroup of ogre. Regardless, all of them can work together if there is sufficient food at stake, but on the whole, they tend to avoid paths, because when they do meet, civil wars tend to happen quite regularly, and they don't get along very well for reasons we'll explain later on. But them clashing is not always a bad thing, right? Because killing other ogres provides a surplus of meat. Cannibalism is not a crime in this society, and any survivors from that war are absorbed into the winning Mawtribe, and so all of a sudden they can kind of just intermingle a bit so that you can have a mix of Beastclaw Raider units in your Gutbusters and so forth. It's all under one Mawtribe. And talking about that society a bit more, every group or mass of ogres is called a Mawtribe, as I mentioned before. And this kind of moniker extends to the Beastclaw Raiders as well. And I wanted to note that the units we'll explore this week are not the whole of the Mawtribe, right? We're talking about the warrior aspects of it. As with all these battle tomes, it's easy to think that this is representative of every single thing in that faction. No, I mean, Cities of Sigmar has people who live in the city but don't fight. Same thing here. There are ogres that stand on the home front, basically, cooking for the masses and raising children and building camps and that kind of thing. But we're talking about the military aspects of it specifically, and a standing army is called a war glut. One Mawtribe, right, one greater tribe, can have several of these standing armies, these war gluts, beneath them, sending them out at different times to go hunt and come back with food, allowing them to have numerous parts of their society. As one is leaving, another is just returning. And when everything is based on food, this constant rhythm of hunt and gather is essential. It keeps the wheels turning. Someone is always actively right then securing the next meal. But when we play Age of Sigmar, right, this part of the society is what we get to interact with, right? We play the units that make up a war glut. Boots on the ground soldiers, raiders, and devourers. These can range in size from a handful of scavengers to a massive army of hundreds, a living sea of fat flesh and hunger. Generally, each of these warglets is led by a mighty tyrant, and heritage doesn't factor into leadership when it comes to this army. This is very much a might makes right. You have to challenge the previous leader, kill them in combat, and then you get to eat them because you won that meat, and you assert yourself as the leader. Because of this strict hierarchy or understanding of might makes right, everyone instinctively listens to the tyrant. They follow his every command. And this tyrant is responsible for all martial discipline within the warglut, conducting warfare, feeding the troops, and returning home with food. There is, however, one thing he doesn't do, and that is a job that belongs to the warglut's slaughtermaster. Right, the slaughtermaster is responsible for steering the warglut. He performs his own mysticism and scries messages and portents out of the gizzards and innards of their creatures they've killed, and from this he kind of discerns a path where Gorka Morka is leading them to next. So in kind of essentially what I'm saying is the tyrant is like a captain of the ship and the slaughtermaster is the navigator. He kind of points them in the direction, but as far as the responsibility, the leadership, keeping things in line and keeping things moving, it's all down to the tyrant. Now, below these two leaders, they really are kind of the main, the highest of higher ups. There's a wide range of followers can come along, right? There's the gut guard, which is the personal honor guard of the tyrant, who is full of powerful ogres that one day will replace him by killing him and eating him, right? That's how you get your next successor leader. Below that, there's butchers working, diligently with supplying the army with their nightly meals under the slaughtermaster. And all sorts of units can vary from warglut to warglut, and we'll cover all of those later in this series. And so why is this faction cool? I try to end every video with something like this. Well, as I said at the top of the episode, right, seeing an entire faction based around something as primal as hunger is fascinating, right? The core of the tribe stays back at their headquarters, right, their glut forts and things like that, constantly preparing food. They when I say preparing food, I mean they cut woods for giant fires, buildings that they're making and living in, scavenging for shards of metal to make pots and pans and resources out of. While the army, usually numerous, right, more than one kind of army out there, multiple wargluts, are in perpetual hunt and gathering cycles. Everything lives in motion, constantly devouring the environment around it. The hunts that the wargluts go on are really, really cool. So if you think about it, you have their base, right? They kind of leave their camp and do a big ring and come back with food. Just imagine they just walk around in a circle basically and come right back around with everything that they were able to capture and kill. Now the next hunt that goes out is going to do that same path, but it's going to be a bigger ring. And so you get these several concentric rings with these little detours that take them off on weird paths. And all of a sudden, they can start creating this almost like a drawing, if you're looking at it from the aerial view, of a giant maw, the one that they worship, the path that's been divined to them specifically by Gorka Morka. However, this hunting cycle all kind of got wonky with the Necroquake. The Slaughtermaster's divination skills went awry. They saw the Necroquake as, this is my favorite thing, Gork's grumble. And that is his stomach was grumbling because the deity didn't think that they were consuming enough, right? That they are the maw of Gorka Morka, and as a species, they were not eating enough stuff. And that's why his stomach is grumbling. So it's Gorka Morka's displeasure. And so now on top of their, normal survival aspects, they have this kind of religious fanaticism that's kind of slowly building as they get more and more concerned with the idea of we're not eating enough. We need to hunt more. We need to grow more ogres so we can send out on bigger and more numerous hunts. And it's really, really cool. All in all, I'm happy with the lore they added to the Gutbusters specifically, because that's mainly what I was focusing on here. I feel like every unit has a place. I was kind of curious about how they were going to fit together with the different kind of butchers they had and that thing. I really do feel like they gave everyone a reason to be there, and I think that's really important. There are even battalions that represent that kind of place in society. For example, my favorite one was the Tyrant and his Gut Guard, right? The narrative idea of having a cadre of devout warriors that all kind of want to kill you and take your place has been a favorite of mine since I read something like that in the Khorne Battle Tome way back in the day. Butchers, like I said before, have a great place, kind of switching from being more like a support hero, but now they're like, oh no, this is like the spiritual like leaders of the faction. I kind of like that. I thought that was a really good move. Practical and divine responsibilities, right? Prep the food and commune with Gorka Morka to point us in the right direction to head for our next meal. So those are my thoughts about the basically the Mawtribes, specifically the Gutbuster portion of it. In my next video, we'll talk about the Beastclaw Raider side. Tell me what your thoughts are. Are you happy with the lore that they've come up with? Do you have anything you want to add? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will catch you there. Thank you so much for watching, and happy wargaming.